As I discussed a few days ago, Rooster Teeth has announced that it's shutting down. However, that has raised many questions about the future of the series under the Rooster Teeth banner. Just to name a few, there was Red vs. Blue, which was supposed to enter its final season, and RWBY, which hadn't even started production on Volume 10. I saw rumors that Volume 10 was supposed to be the finale of RWBY, but I hadn't seen anything concrete about that. Regardless, a lot of people are curious about the future of RWBY. I briefly touched on this in my last video, but I wanted to make a whole video dedicated to the future of the possibilities for RWBY at this time. I have heard several ideas on what should happen to the series moving forward. I wanted to add my own opinion to those ideas and whether they're good or bad. Before that, I'd like to discuss why I believe Warner Bros. Discovery has no interest in keeping RWBY. To start, Warner Bros. Discovery once saw potential in the RWBY IP. If they hadn't, I don't think we would have seen the RWBY crossover with the Justice League. Warner Brothers doesn't let every one of their properties do that, so it seems the crossover was an attempt to get more fans interested in the RWBY property. Plus, before that, RWBY was already getting interest from other companies outside of them and Rooster Teeth. As I mentioned before, Shaft made RWBY Ice Queendom. Team RWBY also appears in Blaze Blue Cross Tag Battle, a fighting game created by Arc System Works. My point is that Warner Bros. Discovery had a reason to see RWBY as a potential moneymaker for them. However, I don't believe the crossover convinced Warner Bros. Discovery to believe that it was worth keeping after all. I want to clarify that I've never seen either of the RWBY Justice League crossovers. Besides no longer being a fan of the series, none of what I saw from them made me interested in checking it out, despite being a fan of DC animated films. However, I did see a review from B Infuso about them, which sums up what I thought we'd see from it. In his review, he discusses how Part 1 assumes you've watched all of RWBY to understand what's happening. As he points out in his review, he's not a fan of RWBY and is a DC fan coming in blind to the RWBY series.
There's a lot of references to the wider RWBY canon, but honestly, it's all lost on me. Like I said, I don't know the show, and the movie doesn't do a fantastic job in explaining it all. It's kind of like if instead of explaining the story to you, the movie just insists that you were there the whole time so you should know by now. But unfortunately, I wasn't, and I don't.
If that's true that the crossover did that, it's a dumb decision to make because you're trying to attract fans of one thing to become fans of yours. It makes Part 1 feel like you had to watch the RWBY series before this to understand everything, but it only turns off the new fans you're hoping to attract. In comparison, I mentioned in my Akira Toriyama video that I watched Dragon Ball Z as a kid. I also saw it before seeing the original Dragon Ball series, where Goku was a kid. However, it never felt like I missed that much because of that. It may have been referenced occasionally, but I could still enjoy Dragon Ball Z as its own thing. My point in bringing up his review is that this crossover didn't seem to do what Warner Brothers expected, and they didn't feel RWBY was worth holding on to. So what does that mean in terms of potential buyers for RWBY? Well, let's start with Shaft. As I said, Shaft was the studio that made RWBY Ice Queendom, and I like it best regarding where RWBY would go now that it's being sold off. In my reviews, I mentioned that I viewed it as a better series, and I made a video about why Yang was better in Ice Queendom. Ice Queendom gave Yang more of a spotlight, despite having half the time that Volume 1 had. While I know fans have given the series mixed reviews, it's the only other studio currently that worked on RWBY. As far as I could tell, Shaft only had to get the green light from Rooster Teeth for any changes they wanted to make for Ice Queendom, and I know I may get hate for this, but I still stand by my reviews where I said Shaft made a better RWBY product than Rooster Teeth. Ice Queendom feels like a series that listened to fans' complaints and made improvements we've wanted to see for years. While it has its own problems, it's still a better product than Rooster Teeth has produced in years, and I think a continuation would be worth seeing. If they decide to buy the RWBY IP, I would be excited to see what directions they choose to take the series and what other changes they'd make moving forward. Another idea I heard was from a comment on my Rooster Teeth video that Arc System Works should get the rights to RWBY. As I said earlier, they're the creators of the Blaze Blue games, and Team RWBY were guests in Blaze Blue Cross Tag Battle. For anyone unfamiliar with them, they're also the ones that made Dragon Ball FighterZ. In terms of possibilities, I'm more in between on this one whether it should or shouldn't happen. On one hand, the idea of RWBY turning into a game series instead does sound fun. It would serve as an excuse to reboot the series instead of continuing it, which some people have said is the right move to make, regardless of who gets the rights. On the other hand, I don't think RWBY should become a fighting game. If RWBY were to become a game, I think it would be better as an RPG similar to Final Fantasy. That's not to say a fighting game series based on RWBY couldn't work, I just don't think it's the best fit for it. For now, I'll say it's a maybe on whether it's a good or bad idea for Arc System Works to get the rights to RWBY. Now, I want to talk about Crunchyroll. Despite Crunchyroll being where RWBY Ice Queendom premiered, RWBY should stay far away from them. The best proof of this is looking back at Crunchyroll's original series, High Guardian Spice. To put it bluntly, High Guardian Spice is notorious for being horrible. I respect Mr. Enter for putting himself through watching every episode, because I couldn't have done that. Speaking of, I am working on a new Mr. Enter video, so be sure to check that out too once it's up. Still, hearing all the issues with the series makes it no surprise that it only got one season. I also doubt that Crunchyroll has learned its lesson, so for all those saying RWBY has been bad for years, it would only get worse under them. I don't like to be negative, but I don't see how the series would get better, let alone survive, if they bought the rights to RWBY. Finally, I want to talk about Dylan Goo Studios. After the news of Rooster Teeth shutting down, Dylan Goo was the first to show interest in purchasing RWBY in a tweet. I also want to point out that I didn't know who Dylan was before that, or that he was one of the ones who worked on the fight animation of RWBY Volume 3. So I checked out the studio's YouTube channel to get an idea of what they could offer if they got the RWBY IP, and saw the pilot for Progenitor. While I wouldn't say Progenitor blew me away, it did what a pilot should do. It hooked me in and made me want to learn more about it. I also learned that it's a cyberpunk AU of Genshin Impact, but I still enjoyed it despite not being a fan of the game. I'm not saying it's a bad game, it's just not my thing. Regardless, you can still watch this and enjoy it, even if you're unfamiliar with Genshin Impact. The only thing about Dylan is that fans have many questions about RWBY if he gets the rights to it. Will he bring Ruby in, or will he have his own staff? Will he continue the story with Volume 10, or decide to reboot the series? Either way, people are still interested in Dylan getting to continue the story in some way. Just to name a few, Jessica Negri, a famous cosplayer slash model who also voices Cinder, has shown her support by replying to his tweet. Another famous cosplayer, Mangaloo Cosplays, has also shown her support in a tweet. She's also the one I interviewed years ago, in case anyone wants to check out that video after this one. Either way, if Dylan does get the rights to RWBY, I'm excited to see what he and his studio decide to do with it. I'm also sure he'll be willing to share his thoughts on where to go with the series if he does end up securing the rights from Warner Brothers. And that's it for now. Chances are, wherever RWBY goes, it will be a while before we find out where that is, or if Warner Brothers could even sell it off. If it does get sold off as soon as possible, I think it would be a few months before we hear anything concrete. Either way, it will be interesting to see what happens. Until then, though, I'm curious what all of you think. Where do you think RWBY will go now that Rooster Teeth is shutting down? Would any of the ones I mentioned in this video be good for RWBY, or is there someone I didn't name that you think would be better? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to see more of my content in the future. I'm Marco Strange. Stay safe, stay strange.